Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for being here today. My name is Skip Rutherford. I'm Dean of the Clinton School, and welcome to another in a great series of programs. This is our 999th program. Nikolai DePippa does a great job at putting these together. And I want to thank him, and I want to thank all the volunteers who help us with each and every one of these programs. If I could ask if you would turn your cell phones and other electronic devices off, that tends to interfere with our equipment. And without making a plug, you all are now going to be a C-SPAN audience. We have C-SPAN here today covering this program, so we'll find out when it's going to be on C-SPAN, and maybe you can see yourselves, which would be a nice thing. To introduce our speaker today is Clinton School student Claire Hodgson. She is a graduate of Arkansas Tech University in Russellville, which, by the way, is the fastest growing college in Arkansas, I might add. She worked with AmeriCorps on programs for homeless youth. And as part of her Clinton School project, she's working with one of my favorite organizations, Centers for Youth and Families, and they're working on a plan to study a therapeutic and garden that would help behavioral health with young people in the state. It's a really interesting concept for a new community garden. So it's very exciting, and she and her team are working on that. Please welcome Claire Hodgson.
11 years ago, Jeff Smith was a relatively unknown political candidate from Missouri, trying to break into the political scene with a run for the U.S. House of Representatives. Thanks to highly successful grassroots campaigning, he rose to the top of a crowded 10-candidate field, narrowly losing to the former Missouri governor's son. The surprising journey was the subject of an award-winning PBS documentary, Can Mr. Smith Even Get to Washington Anymore? A question that was answered one short year later when he won a heavily contested Missouri State Senate seat. And then in 2009, Jeff Smith found himself in a place he never thought he might be. After pleading guilty to campaign misconduct, he found himself behind bars in a Kentucky correctional facility. It was here that he got a first-hand look into what it was really like to be locked up in America. And he saw how race, lack of education, and cyclical poverty were factors that trapped these people into a place that was backwards on purpose. Earlier this year, he published an account of his time in prison and his time in politics in a book titled Mr. Smith Goes to Prison. He would like me to forewarn you that in order to ensure authenticness of all the stories in his book, he has kept the dialect and phrasing, so he hopes that that doesn't offend anyone. Please help me welcome the professor of urban planning in New York City and a contributing writer to Politico and the Recovering Politician website, Professor Jeff Smith.
Thank you so much, Claire, for the generous introduction. Thank you, Skip Rutherford, for the invitation down here and the welcome. I'm truly honored to be here at the Clinton School, to be the 999th speaker here. Apparently there's someone more important than me who's going to be 1,000, but I don't know who that is, who's possibly be more important. Okay. The first CEO or correctional officer that I met had 2 teeth. I couldn't understand a word that he said. Manchester FCI, Federal Correctional Institution, is tucked deep in an Appalachian hollow in southeast Kentucky. And apparently, this CEO had never left. He told me as soon as the gates clanged shut and we spoke, he sent me over to see a nurse, a middle-aged, heavy-set woman. Hot and weight? She asked me. 5'6", 120, I replied. Education level? PhD, I said. She raised her eyebrows at that. Last profession? State senator. Well, we got ones here that think they're Jesus Christ, so you'll fit right in, she told me. She sent me over to another CO who was standing by a bathroom that didn't have a door. Strip, he said to me, and I did. Now let me see your prison wallet. I looked at him quizzically, not understanding. Open up your damn butt cheeks, he ordered me. That was my introduction to federal prison. 6 months earlier, I had been a young, up-and-coming state senator in Missouri. I was bounding up to see my attorney one day. My heart was pounding, and it had been pounding ever since earlier that morning when the feds had knocked on my door. The walls were closing in on me. Back in 2004, 5 years earlier, I had run for the United States Congress. I had been in a race. It was an uphill battle. I'd run against a guy named Russ Carnahan. His father was a successful two-term governor of Missouri who had died tragically in a plane crash on the eve of his U.S. Senate election in 2000. His mother was a U.S. senator. His grandfather was a congressman and ambassador. His sister, Secretary of State. My dad was a golf coach, and my mom worked with kids who had special needs. So it was an uphill battle. But we ended up getting some traction. We had about 650 volunteers, most of them my former students, and a few current students, actually. I always joked that some people thought young people are apathetic, but it's amazing how much you can motivate them if you're an inspirational teacher and you can offer extra credit. But we came very close to winning. We lost by just 1.6%. But there was a dark underbelly to that campaign that the documentary film to which Claire alluded did not catch. About a month before the end of the campaign, a man had approached two of my campaign aides and told them that he wanted to put out a postcard about Mr. Carnahan's dismal attendance record in the state legislature. When my aides approached me to ask about it, I didn't say, "No, that smells fishy, let's not do it." I didn't even say, "Why don't you look into his background a little bit more before you do something?" You know what I said? I said, "I don't want to know any details." They said, "So what should we do?" I said, "Did you hear me? Don't tell me anything, okay?" The postcard came out. It was this tiny thing about this big. Didn't really have any impact on the race at all. Unfortunately, a day before that postcard had come out, I had called a press conference on the steps of the federal courthouse in St. Louis, talking all about Carnahan's attendance record. So the day that the postcard actually came out with that information, which lacked a paid-for-by disclaimer, that opened me up to a complaint that Carnahan filed with the Federal Election Commission. I lost by 1.6%, as I said, and then about a couple weeks later, I went into my attorney's office, and she had prepared an affidavit for me. The affidavit had 15 statements. 14 of them were completely true, but one was not. It denied any advanced knowledge about anything involving that postcard. I thought about the pact I'd made with the other people, my staffers, who had met with the guy who did the postcard. I thought about whether or not the Federal Election Commission would ever investigate this thing, knowing that there's 10,000 complaints like this filed every year. I thought about whether I could afford paying a big fine. And I thought about, pretty vainly, my own political future. And I willed my hand to the paper, and I signed the affidavit. 5 years after that, fast forward to 2009, I'm coming off my most successful session in the state Senate, and my best friend calls me, and he says, "This guy who put out the postcard, Skip, 5 years ago, the feds just picked him up. I said, "For what?" He said, "Illegal weapons possession, drug distribution, spousal abuse, mortgage fraud, bank fraud, wire fraud. Now he's the chief suspect in the car bombing of his ex-wife's divorce lawyer." I'd wanted to win my first campaign so badly and was so desperate that I had let my aides deal with this monster. So my best friend and I, we spent weeks and weeks going back over it. What would we do? What if the feds knocked on our door to ask? What if Skip told them something to try to cut some deal, and then the feds pursued us? And I said, I've already signed an affidavit 5 years ago denying it. I've got to stick to my story. And little did I know that that entire time, my best friend was wearing a wire. When I found out, I drove to my parents' house. It was 5 minutes away, but it was the longest 5 minutes of my life. And I told them to sit down. And I told my mom and my dad that I'd made a mistake 5 years earlier and I was probably going to have to go to prison. And my mom reacted like probably most moms would at that point. She said, "Didn't I tell you not to go into politics?" A couple months later, I pleaded guilty to 2 counts of obstruction of justice and was sentenced to 1 year and a day in federal prison. As a senator, I'd been really focused actually on criminal justice reform. In fact, I'd passed legislation in my final year, Senate Bill 140 and 141, that eased penalties for men who had lost jobs and were struggling to pay child support, many of whom had gotten locked up for their failure to pay, not for a long time, but they'd caught a felony conviction and then had a month or so of jail time, and then when they came out, found it nearly impossible to ever find meaningful employment. And I'd worked hard to try to ameliorate their plight and change these penalties from felonies to misdemeanors and change the sentences from prison or jail to alternative sentences where they could get vocational training and other services. But now, the tables were turned. I was no longer making the laws that would affect people accused of crimes and affect the operation of the prison system. Now the tables were turned, and once the gates clanged shut, it was COs who had all the power over me. It was they and the other prisoners who knew the score, and my education would be pretty rocky. I remember walking up the compound for the first time, and it's pretty much exactly like it is in the movies. You walk up the yard, and there's just dozens of people on both sides screaming things that were incomprehensible to me. Turned out they were saying numbers, 075, 044, 163. Didn't know what any of it meant. I would later find that what it meant was those were the last 3 digits of your prison number. And the last 3 digits signify the federal district court, the jurisdiction from which you hailed. And so people are calling out numbers to figure out who are their homies, who are the people who they will be compelled to protect if there is a fight. People were almost jubilant, slapping hands and knocking fists, catching up with people that they'd known at other prisons. It seemed so incongruous to me, this white guy with a PhD who was a former state senator. It was only upon reflection that I realized for many of these guys, the way that they were acting, almost as if it were a reunion, it made sense because they were never going to have a reunion. They weren't going to be at a high school reunion. They weren't going to be at a college reunion because most of them didn't have any formal education, had never graduated high school. I walked up and was introduced to my cellie. His name was Red because he resembled Morgan Freeman's character in Shawshank Redemption. He said, "How long you got?" I said, 1 year and a day. He said, "Damn, I've done more time in this joint on the toilet than you got time." And it made me realize how lucky I was. He'd been in and out of prison for 25 years at that point on a dizzying array of charges. 1 week in, I was awakened at 6 a.m. when the loudspeaker called my name and ordered me to go down to the admin building. And I was actually kind of excited. I thought there was one of 2 possibilities, either that I was going to have to sign mail requiring my signature, or that my request to teach, I had applied to teach civics or black history in the prison education department. I was hoping that one of those requests had been granted. I thought my cellie was asleep. It was 6 a.m., but I heard him say something to me as I was walking out the door. He probably noticed the bounce in my step, and he said, he laughed at me. He said, look, Cellie, they ain't call you down there to sign no mail. I was like, oh yeah? He said, yep. And they sure as shit ain't call you down there to tell you you're going to be teaching no convicts. Not at 6 a.m. I walked down to the admin building. It was a heavy-set goateed man in a brown shirt and brown tie. He was the prison captain. If prison were private school, that'd be like the dean of discipline. He said, Inmate Smith, I got a question for you. If I wanted to know something about politics, you think it'd be better if I popped off like I knew something, or if I listened to an expert such as yourself? I said it'd probably be better to speak to an expert. He said, so if you wanted to know a little something about prison, you think it'd be better to come in like you know everything, or maybe to wait and ask some people who know something? Probably better to wait, ask people. Because I've been working in prisons almost 20 years, and I got some advice for you, because you ain't blending so well. And these notes you taking, because I was taking notes on napkins, which became the book. And he said, this book you writing, you ain't blending so well, and you know what? I think you's conducting a business out here in the prison, and that's illegal. I said, sir, with all due respect, I consulted the prison handbook, and I saw the prohibitions on running a tattoo parlor out of your cell or selling phones or pornography. And the way I interpret it, I'm not running a business. I'm just taking notes that might someday become a book. He said, I see, Inmate Smith. Is that the way you interpret it? Because I got some news for you. This here ain't no Senate, and this ain't no Supreme Court. And if I think you's conducting a business, you's probably conducting a business. And if you ain't, we'll throw you in the shoe for 6 months while we figure it out. The shoe was solitary confinement, and that scared the hell out of me. The next day, I was given my work detail. That was me as a politician. That was me with my colleagues. You can probably tell which one I am. I worked in the prison warehouse at the loading dock, moving about 35 to 40,000 pounds of food every day in and out of massive freezers that were about as big as the room that we're in right now. Why so much food? Well, it wasn't that prisoners ate that much food every day. It was that every time you move food in, you have to move the old food from the back of the freezer to the front of the freezer, and so you have to move the new food into the back, and you have to basically move everything about 3 times what actually comes in. The food in the back had expiration dates mostly in 2006 or 2007. At this point, it was 2010. When I was young, one time I went off to basketball camp, and I remember in the back of my shirt, I told my parents I thought my last name was Irregular because all my clothes were stamped Irregular. Well, in prison, all the food has similar stamps. It's stamped things like for institutional use only, or as one of the COs told us, up until about a year earlier, the fish had all been stamped not for human consumption. I mention all this not to suggest that prisoners deserve to eat filet mignon, but to say that the obviously repulsive and spoiled food told us in no uncertain terms that we were something less than human. We weren't quite animals, but we definitely weren't human in the eyes of the prison. There's a lot of poverty in prison, and people don't realize that. The conventional wisdom is that you get 3 hots and a cot, you got it made, but it doesn't quite work like that, and here's why. When you go into prison, most people are broke. A lot of people already have court fees or fines that they owe money on, don't have any savings, especially in drug cases. The feds have seized all their assets and those of their loved ones as well, if they can prove that there was any connection to profits or proceeds from the drug trade. And yet, when you get to prison, you realize that you have to pay for things on your own. So deodorant, shampoo, soap, most of the basics of hygiene, you have to go to the prison commissary or canteen and order them, and they're usually marked up between 30 and 50% from what you'd pay on the street. And so people in prison are hustling all the time to get money to survive, to have basic hygiene, or as a luxury, to buy pens or pencils or paper or stamps to try to stay in touch with their loved ones. This is just one reason that I'll describe of why prison is actually criminogenic, why it encourages things that are actually criminal, both inside prisons and then upon reentry. When I got to the warehouse, our boss, Miss Horton, a lady with short, spiky gray hair and a gruff manner, she promised us that she would feed us well as long as she never caught anyone stealing. I took that seriously. I had promised my girlfriend, my parents, I would not break a single rule while I was in there. And the first day, I remember, all 6 guys I worked with, went home with chicken patties saran wrapped around their chest and green peppers and onions stuffed in all their pockets to go back to the yard and then trade for other items or sell to get money to, for things that could make their life a little bit easier in prison, such as money for phone calls. About a week into my bid, another prisoner came to me and said, "Hey, look, Senator," because that was my nickname. Everybody has a nickname in prison. You can't fight it. You just have to accept it. Although whenever Miss Horton caught the other guys calling me Senator, she'd say, "His name is Smith. He ain't no senator. He's a convict, just like all you." Another prisoner came up to me and said, "Look, the guys that you're working with, one of them's about to plant raw meat in your freezer jacket." I said, "Why would they do that? I didn't do anything to any of them." And he said, "Look, just shut up and listen. Raw meat is like as much trouble as you can get in. It's as serious an infraction as like inciting a riot. Because if it's spoiled and it infects the whole compound with like E. coli, then people could just start dying. And so it's treated very seriously. And they're about to put it in your freezer jacket." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because you're not stealing. And so they figure you're about to rat them all out." I said, No, I'm not going to do that." He said, "Well, then you better start stealing." So I didn't know what to do because I didn't know if this guy was serious and trying to look out for me or if he was trying to set me up and frame me for stealing. So I started because I knew how serious the penalty could be for being caught with raw meat. It could get you a new charge, sent to a high-security prison, and put in solitary for a long time. I'd seen guys who'd come out of solitary. They talked about the claustrophobia, the rage, the depression. It's been described as slow-motion torture. And so one day, I waited for Miss Horton to back away out of the line of sight, and I stuffed a bunch of green peppers into my pants. And when I got back to the compound, one of my fellow prisoners there saw me, and I took out some of the peppers, and he said, "Damn," he said, "the senator's a regular convict now." And there was no higher praise in prison. To anoint someone a convict in prison is like endowing a professor. And this incident did more than just keep me out of trouble. It taught me about a defining feature of prison life: ingenuity. The ingenuity I saw was unbelievable. Let me give you an example. BJ was a guy who lived on my cell block, and he was one of many men I met with incredible entrepreneurial talent. He had big plans for the future. He had two passions: beautiful redheads and luxury sports cars. And he'd figured out a way to merge his two passions into one endeavor. He'd appointed his 19-year-old son on the outside vice president for talent development, and they'd bought a domain, a website, that exclusively featured beautiful redheads having sex on top of luxury sports cars. Prison was teeming with guys like this. Not all their business ideas were that lurid. Most of them wanted to start barbershops, or personal fitness businesses, or landscaping businesses, or home health care businesses. They all had big plans. And they all understood intuitively how businesses worked. They wouldn't have been in the federal system if they hadn't been pretty successful drug dealers, right? And there's not a single concept that you could learn at Harvard Business School that you couldn't learn in prison. Territorial expansion, new product launch, quality control, risk management, supply chain management. Every single one of these concepts I heard prisoners allude to in somewhat different language than you'd hear at Wharton, but the same concepts. But the sad thing is that there was no mechanism at all for prisoners to turn these plans into reality. The only course offered my whole time there was one short GED course and then a course on hydroponics, how to grow tomatoes in water. Nothing practical at all. Upon release, every year, about 625,000 prisoners come back to America's doorsteps. Back to the same communities where they failed before, only now they have the added stigma of a prison record. 2 out of 3 of them will reoffend within 3 years. And the main reason why is financial struggle. One way that we can change that, okay, is prison education. Many studies, including a recent meta-study by RAND, which looked at dozens of studies of different prison education programs, have shown that the returns to prison education are huge, because educational advancement while incarcerated is one of 2 things that's been shown to significantly reduce recidivism. But only when society stops seeing prisoners as society's throwaways and actual human beings with real potential will we start to, I think, spend money and make this important investment. A second way we know we can reduce recidivism is by helping prisoners stay in close contact with their loved ones. And yet, right now, prison does so much to actually make that harder. Let me give you an example. What does it cost to call long distance these days if you're calling landline to landline? Like a nickel a minute or so now? Well, in prison, it costs between $1 and $2 a minute. And if you're making, I was making for full-time work in the warehouse, $5.25, not per hour, but per month. So if that's your monthly wage, and a 5-minute phone call takes up your whole monthly wage, and you have to provide your own, deodorant or shampoo, how close of contact do you think you're going to be in with your loved ones? Probably not very close. And of course, now that we've privatized so many services inside our prison system, firms are making tons of money on the backs of people who can least afford it and who are most vulnerable. That is, impoverished prisoners. How can we change this? Well, some would say, this is a democracy, why don't we vote? Of course, the problem is that prisoners can't vote, and people on probation in most states can't vote, and no one has ever lost an election by being too tough on crime, right? Furthermore, the way that we've reapportioned populations, since most prisons exist in rural areas, we've taken people from urban areas and we've put them in conservative rural areas where their votes are counted, or where their votes aren't counted, but their heads are counted for representational purposes. It's kind of like a modern 3/5 compromise, okay, because prisoners are counted, except they're counted 0/5 when it comes time to vote, but 5/5 when it comes time to apportion how many legislators different parts of a state will get. And I tell you what, the other terrible byproduct of this is that it places people further away from their loved ones. Very few things have ever broken my heart as much as watching guys who have $2 on their books make a phone call and try to start talking to a child or an ex-wife or a girlfriend, and then have the phone be cut off just as they're beginning the conversation because they ran out of money. The only thing that compared was watching children cling to a father's leg when visiting hours were over. This whole system, in particular the transfer of prisoners to rural areas where their political power is captured by typically conservative Republican representation, suggests that the system that operates and almost ensures high recidivism rates is not broken. In fact, it's a well-oiled machine. One final important way that prison is criminogenic is that prison has become what one author recently referred to as a training ground for rapists. Estimates show that there are over 250,000 rapes every year in our prisons, and the consequences are severe. Serious psychological trauma and much higher recidivism rates among those who are the victims of sexual abuse and sexual violence. Tragically, because of the almost total lack of psychological services or therapeutic services inside prison, the untreated victims of rape often commit rapes upon their release in a desperate attempt to reclaim the manhood that was violently taken from them in their eyes during prison. When I got to prison, they showed us an orientation video. It featured a guy, a white guy, seemed like could have been an accountant. And he talked about his first experience going to prison when someone left a candy bar on his pillow and he inadvertently ate it, thinking that was nice. It was sort of like going to the Hilton and someone leaves a chocolate on your pillow. The problem is that in prison it signifies your willingness to a cellie. Everyone laughed at the video. I laughed too. Upon reflection, I realized how not funny it was. And yet, even though I saw frequent fights in prison, the one act of violence I did not see was rape. Actually, I saw love. One night, I saw a newbie walking down our cell block, and he was staring into one cell because two guys, one guy named Porkchop, another guy named JT, were in bed together, snuggling. You know, it's hard to be gone for 15 or 20 years without any human contact. And this newbie who was walking down the hall, he started to snicker. And then I saw one of the veterans, a real old head, been locked up a long time, and he just looked at the newbie. He said, it ain't none of your mother freaking business what they're doing in there. After that, no one ever said a word, and they spent every night, these two inmates, snuggling. Anyone who's ever been locked up knows how dehumanizing it can be. But what sort of inspired me is the way in which, whether it was BJ with his entrepreneurial business, his website idea with cars and women, or whether it was some other prisoners who I tutored at night working on their GED as they learned to read, or whether it was these two guys in bed. The human spirit triumphed even in the most adverse circumstances. And that should remind all of us that we shouldn't just write off 2.2 million people who are incarcerated in this country as if they were so much refuse. And in fact, reminds us that every one of us can play a part in nurturing and helping redeem the souls that are incarcerated. You know, I spent less than a year in prison. I had every single advantage relative to most of the guys I was locked up with. I had a PhD from a top university. I had incredible family and community support. 300 people wrote letters to the judge on my behalf requesting clemency, including the lieutenant governor, the state auditor, the attorney general, the mayor of St. Louis. I had savings. I had a suit that I could wear to a job interview when I came out. The guys I was locked up with had none of that. Most of them had, as I said, a GED earned in prison, if that. They had no savings. When I worked with some of them on resumes, they didn't even have anyone they could list as a reference because they didn't know anyone who was currently employed. And yet, in spite of all the advantages that I had a hard time getting a job when I came out. And so imagine how hard it is for someone with none of those things, who is walking out of prison into a society in which 9 out of every 10 employers conducts criminal background checks, and most will not hire anyone who comes up positive, in which 4 out of every 5 landlords conduct background checks and then would never rent to someone who has a criminal history. Imagine how hard it is when you come out still owing money, and you've got a child that you're expected to provide for, and you've got to pay for your room in a halfway house, and you've got to pay for your drug tests, and you've got to try to find money to get decent clothes to go to a job interview when they send you home with a $10 bill for a meal. It's not surprising when you see our recidivism rate. The only thing that is surprising is that only 2 out of 3 people reoffend. Barack Obama did something pretty special when he visited a prison the other day. No American president has ever done that before, so it was important symbolically. But what he said, I think, was even more important. He said, I looked at those guys, and I thought about some of the mistakes I made growing up, and dabbling in drugs, I assume, is what he was referring to. And he said, and I realized that could have been me. And until our society collectively adopts that worldview, that could be my cousin, my brother, my daughter, my son, or me, we won't transform the way our prisons operate in the way we need to reduce recidivism, save millions of lives and human potential, and dramatically increase our public safety. So I hope that you will all consider visiting a prison, visiting someone you know, teaching in a prison, becoming a pen pal to someone in prison, just doing one little thing. And I bet once you start, you will become as changed by it as I was by my year in prison. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeff. We now have some time for questions. Please raise your hands and we'll get back to you.
Jeff, I show your documentary in my film class all the time. One of the things I wanted to ask you was that, and I think you've already answered it, is that how come none of the candidates really talk about this? Of course, as you say, it's better to talk about putting people in prison rather than getting them out. But it's obviously an important issue, and I think we even knew that before you came. So why is that not on anyone's agenda, so to speak? I haven't heard any of that this time around, but that might be obvious given the situation.
Professor, what's your name?
It's Art English.
Okay. Oh, yeah. Jay Barth has told me about you. Thanks for showing the documentary. I'll Skype in if you ever want me to Skype in, so get in touch with me and I'll talk to your students. Okay, so why aren't people talking about this? Well, some have tried. There's pending legislation, the REDEEM Act, that is bipartisan in U.S. Congress. Cory Booker is the Democratic lead sponsor. Rand Paul is the Republican lead sponsor. And the REDEEM Act would do some great things. It would reduce mandatory minimum sentences. It would, both on the sentencing side and on the reentry side, it would go a long way towards doing some things we need to do in this country. But if you look at Rand Paul, he's kind of an example for maybe why politicians don't talk about it more. He was seen as a front runner for the Republican nomination a year ago, and then he started talking about Ferguson and prison reform and things that affect minority voters in this country. And he sold himself as a different kind of Republican who could reach out and relate to minority voters. Unfortunately, what appears to have gotten more traction in the Republican primary is someone who has mocked Black Lives Matter protesters and vows to get rid of birthright citizenship and immediately erect a fence on our southern border. And so, sadly, it's hard to, it's been hard to get traction with these issues. I'm hopeful that things can change. Every different major philosophical strand in the Republican Party has a reason to support prison reform. Evangelical Christians, led by people like Chuck Colson, want to save souls. Fiscal conservatives like Nathan Deal, the governor of Georgia, Nikki Haley, the governor of South Carolina, both of whom have closed prisons and reduced their prison populations, they want to do it to save money. And libertarian conservatives like Rand Paul want to decriminalize drugs because they don't want big government in people's lives. So all three major philosophical strands of today's Republican coalition have a reason to support prison reform. And a lot of Democrats already support it. Not all, because Democrats in some states like California are too beholden to the prison guards union, who are one of the most important political forces in all California politics. Sadly, it wasn't conservatives that pushed 3 strikes and you're out so much in California as it was the prison guards union. And there's no mystery why they wanted to lock people up longer. So I think why don't people talk about it? There's a lot of people who benefit from the system as it is. There's guards and there's a lot of vendors, and we need to show how changing the system will save taxpayers tons of money if we actually operate our prisons more like Scandinavia, which operate prisons more like a break from society where you can get retrained with the skill to make sure you will never come back. Thanks for the question, Professor.
Tyler, you had your hand up.
Hey, Jeff. My name is Tyler Pearson. I'm a graduate of the Clinton School. I graduated here last year. I saw your documentary when I was in school here, and it was very inspiring. Right around the time I graduated, I chose to run for the Arkansas State Senate here in Arkansas, and I ran a very progressive grassroots campaign against a very notorious and infamously vindictive state senator here in Arkansas. And while we were not successful in winning the election, I feel like what we did had a big impact. I left very inspired, and I'm still involved, and I still want to do more. In my campaign, prison reform, and specifically parole reform, played an important role because here in Arkansas, as you may know, we have the fastest growing prison population in the country right now, 17.3% growth rates. That's after we were decreasing our prison population. In 2011, we passed some big reforms, started shrinking it. Some very tragic incidents occurred. You had some knee-jerk reactionary policies that were put into place that completely reversed the trend. So my question to you is, if there were, say, hypothetically, a young progressive candidate running for office, what could they do to connect this issue with the voters? Is it an empathy message? Is it a fiscal message? And what strategies, if any, do you have that someone like that could use?
That's a great question, Tyler, and thanks. I'm glad to hear that you're still inspired after an unsuccessful campaign, and I hope you come back and try to run again. So I think the fiscal argument is probably the best one. And I don't necessarily think that is the most inspiring one. I think if you have certain types of voters, or if you're going to a church to talk, then I think I would use a different message. But I think most voters are moved by fiscal realities and the taxes that they pay. And if you can talk to voters about the fact that the way that we operate our prisons is costing them every single day because it's simply a revolving door that they're paying for, and you can talk to them about the importance of prison education and educational advancement, then I think, talking from a two-pronged perspective, this is how we can save you money instead of continuing to pay to lock up the same people over and over, and this is how we can make sure that you're not a crime victim. Because the dehumanizing and brutal experience that so many prisoners have is what, again, facilitates crime upon reentry. And unless you begin to break that cycle in the same way that we talk about breaking cycles of abuse within families, then we're going to keep paying that price, fiscally and in terms of victimization. Thanks for the question.
Yes, sir, right here. Wait for the microphone's coming at you, please.
Jeff, my name's Kevin. Here's my question. I'm just a little confused or curious. Based on your background and the nature of your offense, why were you in this facility as opposed to a federal camp? Or in fact, was this a camp?
This was a camp. It was a work camp.
Okay.
It's 98% drug dealers. The notion of like white collar prisons, I think that was probably true in the 80s. I did a little research on it for my book, but it doesn't exist anymore insofar as I know. Maybe it does, but I know I wasn't sent to one. There were like 5 other white collar prisoners.
So this actually was the lowest level
This
of
was
federal...
low security.
I got you.
Yes, ma'am, right here at the back, right behind, right there.
Yes, Harry Weisenstein. Are you eligible to run for office again?
You know, there is a convicted felon in Congress right now. And before you start joking and saying, actually, there's 435 of them, there's one who represents Florida who was a judge that was convicted of taking bribes. I could run for some offices, but not others. I couldn't run for the Missouri Senate, which is where I once served. I could run for Congress. But I will tell you, and I should probably show one other picture, which is my life now with the girl that she had moved into my house 2 days before I found out my friend was wired. And I told her that day that she should probably just get her boxes that hadn't been unpacked yet and leave because I was going to have to go away for a while. And thankfully, she stayed, came and saw me in Southeast Kentucky, and, you know, we're blessed right now with 2 children. But you asked about running for office again, and that's why I brought her up, because the day that I go to the courthouse to file for office again, I will run into her filing for divorce.
Yes, right there. Right, yes, ma'am.
Yes. You mentioned the problem of people from urban areas being sent to prisons in rural areas, and the fact that when it comes to counting them in the census, they were counted in those conservative areas. So I served on a Census Bureau committee for a number of years, and at those meetings, there was always a group there trying to get the Census Bureau to change the way those persons are enumerated. I'm wondering if you're familiar with that group. I can't remember the name. And if you have done any work with them, and if you think that effort that getting people counted where they lived before going to prison will ever be successful.
That's a great question. What's your name?
It's Mary McGee.
Mary, thanks for the question. I've heard of efforts in that regard. I haven't done any work with them. I probably should, because as a political scientist with a passion for this stuff, it would make sense. I've focused my advocacy since coming out on prison entrepreneurship. I'm on the board of a nonprofit called the Prison Entrepreneurship Program, which does an 8-month MBA level curriculum inside of 2 Texas state prisons. And over the last decade, their graduates have a recidivism rate of just 6%. So less than 1/10 the national rate. So that's an amazing organization. And then another organization that's trying to put a tablet in the hands of every inmate that has a full suite of vocational training and educational software. Those have been the 2 places I've focused my efforts. But I think I want to learn more, so let's talk afterwards. And if we don't get a chance to catch up, then I'll Google it and try to learn more, because I have not heard of any progress in that area, though.
Yes, ma'am, right back here.
You alluded to this, but you didn't really expand upon it, and so I'd ask that you expand upon it. My name is Sarah Harbour. That when you went up against the Carnahans politically, their dynasty or whatever you want to call it, that it may have put a target on your back for this investigation. And we heard this young man talk about going up against, you know, a powerful, vindictive local politician. And so as a political scientist, have you looked at any of those types of situations where it might have a chilling effect on people who want to run, but there might be some retaliation there?
That's a great question, Sarah. I have not looked at any of that as a political scientist. A reporter who profiled my case years ago, he found that The Federal Election Commission basically did nothing about that, did almost nothing about that postcard for a couple of years after I signed the affidavit. And then right after I got elected to the state Senate, then I think there was some communication between the Carnahan Congressional Office and the Federal Election Commission. Once I got to the state Senate, since it has 4-year terms, it would have been very easy for me to run for Congress in like an off cycle for me. And so I don't know if I was targeted. I know that I asked the Carnahans to drop the FEC complaint right 2 days after I lost to him. I remember the meeting like it was yesterday. I told him, I'll endorse you, I'll raise money for you, I'll knock on doors for you, I'll get my volunteers to help you. Do you think you'd drop that FEC complaint? Because I knew. And they replied that the missile had already left the silo. And so, yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely a danger to candidates that take on the establishment, that take on powerful people. We've seen lots of instances of this sort of thing. And when you go into public life, to some extent, you have to accept that as, you know, one potential price. But the fact is I committed a crime, and even though it was very, very unusual for someone to do what I did and end up going to prison for it, you know, I'm not saying I was singled, you know, I mean, somebody's always going to be the one to get caught. It's too bad for me that it was me.
We have time for one more question. Bob will get you the microphone.
Fortunately, I have never had exposure to the criminal justice system, but it has been my belief all of these years that a felony conviction automatically disqualified a person from the majority of gainful employment, which you alluded to in your presentation. If you don't mind, would you talk a little more about what the struggles you had getting gainful employment?
Sure. When I came out, I remember I got a phone call from a guy who is active in affordable housing in Missouri and fights to protect our state low-income housing tax credit. And he called me, he said, "What are you doing now?" I said, "Nothing. I'd just come home." And he said, "Would you be interested in maybe working to help us, because we're under assault in the state legislature? And I know you got a lot of friends up there, because like half my colleagues in the state Senate had written letters on my behalf to the judge." He said, "We need someone to help us raise money, build a grassroots organization around the state, and effectively navigate the legislature to keep affordable housing from getting our program cut." And I said, "Okay, how much are you paying?" And he said, "Well, look, Jeff, I'm going to be honest with you. I'm about to tell you a number that is going to be pretty insulting. But let me tell you, the reason I'm calling you," he said, "I'm not calling you out of pity." I said to him, "Look, thank you so much for reaching out to me," because no one else had with a job. I said, "Thank you so much for reaching out." He said, "Jeff, I'm not doing this for charity. I'm doing this because if I'd have hired you a year ago, straight out of the Senate, I'd have to offer you about 20 times the number I'm about to quote you." I went to that interview, and the last question I got, a woman said, "You know, all your answers have been great. I think you do a fantastic job. But why should we be the ones to take the hit for hiring you? There's going to be ugly stories about you being a criminal, and now affordable housing is affiliated with a criminal. Why shouldn't we let some other group hire you, and then we'll hire you once the stench is off?" I don't know if it was the fact that I had just been locked up for a year and I still had aggression from the experiences. I got in a lot of scrapes while I was in there. I don't know if it was just the reaction that you learn in prison to never back down from anything, to show weakness, Or I don't know if it was just because I had fallen so far that I didn't have much further to fall. But I said to her, look, I've told you what I can do. And if you can find someone else who can call the Speaker of the House and have the Speaker pick up, who can raise money, who has a background of raising money, who has a background of mobilizing people at the grassroots, who can do all these things better than I can do for this salary, you hire them instead, okay? And I walked out. And that's another thing that makes it, I think, hard for ex-offenders is questions, even when you know in your head you should probably react more diplomatically or thoughtfully, even though I didn't suffer any deep psychological trauma in the way that so many others do in prison, it was hard for me to be spoken to like that and have my background referred to as a stigma or a stench around me. So I am blessed. People like Skip, who reached out to me afterwards and talked to me about a job, and the new school where I applied, and I wrote in my cover letter, the first sentence was, last week I walked out of federal prison. Because I thought in the age of Google, there's no use in disguising it. And the guy who chaired the search committee that ultimately hired me, he said, I'm going to be honest with you. We got almost 1,000, applicants for this job. And let's just say that your cover letter definitely grabbed me. Thank you all so much. I'll be signing books afterwards.